Traore signed the land reform order and felt the air in the capital change. Not because of the ink, because of what the ink threatened. From that moment on, strategic land would no longer be sold off through quiet contracts and long leases that looked legal on paper but functioned like slow-motion seizure. No more deals that turned farmland into private empires while villages stayed hungry. No more signatures that transferred the future to people who never touched the soil. Traore did not frame it as ideology. He framed it as survival. He had studied the country's food dependency, the rising price shocks, the way farmers were being pushed off productive land by contract landlords and intermediaries who promised development and delivered fences. He knew what land really was, not property, power. He also knew what would happen the instant he touched it. The beneficiaries of the old system would not argue policy. They would argue fear. They would call it confiscation. They would warn of chaos. They would fund lawsuits, sponsor protests, and flood the streets with the same poisonous rumor: the government is coming for your land. Traore anticipated that rumor before it was spoken. Because land reform does not threaten only wealth, it threatens control. He looked down at the document, mind cold, and understood the true battle he had just entered. This was not farmers versus landlords. This was life versus disguised ownership. And now the country would have to choose who the soil belongs to. Traore knew land fights are never only about land. They are about identity, memory, and fear. A family can survive a bad season. A family can survive a price spike. But when a family loses its plot, it loses the one asset that can regenerate itself. Land is not just food. It is dignity. It is inheritance. It is leverage. Traore had seen how strategic land was being captured without tanks, without headlines, without elections. It was being captured through paper, long leases that lasted longer than lifetimes, development contracts that paid communities once and then extracted value for decades, transfers pushed through intermediaries who spoke fluent bureaucracy and treated villages like signatures. So the reform order targeted the method, not the myth. It tightened transfer rights for strategic land, especially productive farmland and corridor zones tied to food supply and national security. It placed strict limits on long leases that functioned like ownership. It required new transparency on land deals, including the true beneficiary behind each contract, and it prioritized cultivation and food security over speculative capture. Traore did not say, "We are taking your land." He said, "We are ending disguised seizure." But the beneficiaries heard only one thing: the game is ending. Within hours, the first counterattack arrived in legal language. A coalition of contract landlords and intermediaries filed challenges claiming the reform violated property rights and investor protections. They framed themselves as victims of arbitrary policy. They used the word certainty over and over, as if certainty was a moral value. Traore understood the trick. They wanted the public to confuse certainty for investors with certainty for farmers. In reality, farmers had been living with uncertainty for years. A signature in a distant office could change their future. A lease agreement could fence off grazing routes. A project could erase access to water. Traore was trying to give farmers certainty. The lawsuits were trying to keep certainty for contracts that treated villages as obstacles. Then the second counterattack arrived even faster because it did not require judges. Rumors. Stories spread through markets and messaging channels that Traore was confiscating land, that the state would seize family plots, that people would be forced off their farms. Traore felt the danger immediately. A land panic spreads like fire because it touches survival. If enough people believed the rumor, protests could explode. And protests, once burning, can be hijacked by those who funded the panic in the first place. He moved to contain the fear, not by scolding the public, but by clarifying the target. He instructed local administrators to deliver one consistent message: family farmland is protected. Cultivation rights are strengthened. The reform is aimed at strategic capture through long leases and shell deals. He knew the words would not be enough, so he created a visible mechanism. He ordered a National Land Review Commission to begin verifying contested strategic contracts, not in secret, in a structured way that communities could witness. Public hearings, document disclosure, beneficiary identification, and appeal procedures that did not require expensive lawyers to access. Because Traore understood why the contract landlords were confident. They relied on a system where ordinary farmers could not fight paper. He was building a system where farmers could. That is when the third counterattack arrived. Provocation. Organizers began scheduling demonstrations with suspicious timing and identical messaging. Some were real farmers with real anxiety, but in the crowd were also hired voices, pushing violence, pushing confrontation, pushing the kind of images that travel internationally. Traore recognized the tactic. Turn a reform into a crackdown by forcing security forces into a bad moment. Capture one violent clip, export it, and the reform becomes a story of repression instead of food security. He refused the trap. He ordered restraint protocols for security, strict engagement rules, and rapid de-escalation teams to separate genuine community concerns from paid agitation. He wanted the public to see that the state was not fighting farmers, it was defending them. Meanwhile, the contract landlords escalated the narrative internationally. They warned that Burkina Faso was becoming hostile to business. They claimed property rights were collapsing. They tried to trigger investor panic so that the reform would be blamed for economic instability. Traore's response was the same disciplined distinction again. We welcome investment that builds local food capacity and respects community rights. We reject capture that fences off the future. That line forced a simple question into the open. If an investor needs secrecy and lifetime leases to profit, what exactly is being invested in? Traore then pushed the reform deeper into implementation. He prioritized mapping and registering community land use rights so villages could prove their claims when challenged. He expanded support for cultivation and local food supply chains because land reform without food outcomes becomes fragile. He demanded audits of strategic land deals that had been signed in rushed windows, often right before political transitions, often with the same intermediaries. And as those audits began, something changed in the capital. The panic shifted, because the beneficiaries began to realize Traore was not just making announcements, he was building enforcement. They could fight in court, they could fund rumors, they could stage protests, but they could not easily hide the paper anymore. And in a land war, hiding the paper is everything. Traore looked at the early findings and felt the scale of what he was up against. This was not a few bad deals. This was a model that treated soil as a commodity and farmers as removable. He was dismantling that model, and he knew the next phase would be harsher, because once capture is threatened, it does not retreat politely. It fights. Traore watched the panic narrative evolve the way a soldier watches an enemy adjust tactics. At first it was rumor, scattered and messy. Then it became messaging, polished and synchronized. The same phrases appeared in different towns, as if a script was being distributed. People who had never attended meetings suddenly spoke with the same legal vocabulary. The word confiscation repeated like a drumbeat, designed to trigger fear before facts could arrive. Traore understood what was happening. The beneficiaries of capture were trying to weaponize ordinary farmers against reform, not because they cared about farmers, because farmers were the perfect shield. If enough farmers believed the state was taking land, then the contract landlords could stand behind that outrage and call themselves defenders of freedom. Traore refused to let that inversion stand. He ordered his teams to identify the difference between genuine fear and manufactured agitation. He instructed local authorities to hold open community sessions, not for propaganda, but for verification. Bring your contract. Bring your land use history. Bring your dispute. Let it be seen. But he also knew public sessions alone would not stop a coordinated disinformation machine. The machine thrives on speed. It spreads fear faster than truth can travel, so Traore changed the tempo. He created immediate protective guarantees, a clear public commitment that family farmland under cultivation would not be seized, paired with a rapid complaint channel for any abuse. He understood the only way to break panic is to make safety feel real, not theoretical. Then he struck at the engine behind the panic, the contract landlords and intermediaries. He ordered investigators to map who was funding the agitation, not by guessing motives, but by tracing logistics. Who paid for buses? Who printed signs? Who arranged loudspeakers? Who was providing food and stipends to demonstrators? Protests do not organize themselves at scale without resources, and resources leave trails. His team began uncovering the pattern quickly. Certain transporters appeared repeatedly. Certain organizers were always present, even in towns they did not belong to. Certain community leaders had recently received payments from entities connected to long lease beneficiaries. Traore felt his suspicion harden into certainty. This was not organic resistance to reform. This was a counteroffensive funded by the capture class. At the same time, lawsuits multiplied, not because they expected to win quickly, but because they wanted to slow the reform and create administrative fatigue. Every injunction request was designed to stall audits, freeze reviews, and exhaust local administrators until enforcement weakened and the old model quietly returned. Traore countered with structure. He ordered a dedicated legal unit to consolidate the cases, standardize defenses, and prevent the courts from becoming a maze. He also pushed legislative reinforcement so that the reform could not be killed by procedural games. He knew delay was the favorite weapon of contract empires. If they cannot win the argument, they try to win the calendar. Then the most dangerous phase arrived. A protest in a strategic zone turned violent, not spontaneously, but through a provocation pattern Traore recognized. A small group pushed toward confrontation, baiting security forces into reacting. Phones were raised. Cameras hunted for one image that could travel globally. Traore's orders had anticipated this exact moment. Restraint first. Separation, not suppression. He deployed de-escalation teams trained to isolate agitators from genuine farmers. He instructed commanders to avoid the kind of response that creates martyrs and international headlines. But he also ordered something else, something the agitators did not expect: rapid arrests of non-local instigators based on documented coordination. Not mass arrests of farmers. That choice mattered. It removed the professional provocateurs without turning the reform into a war on the public. And as those instigators were processed, financial links began to surface. Phone contacts, payment records, connections to intermediaries tied to disputed land deals. Traore saw the web tightening. He then made a decisive implementation move that forced the capture class into a corner. He announced that strategic land contracts under review would be suspended from expansion until beneficiary identification and community impact verification were complete. The contracts would not be allowed to grow while being investigated. No new fencing, no new displacement, no new lease transfers. The capture class panicked because expansion is how their power becomes irreversible. If you fence and build, you create facts on the ground. Facts become bargaining chips. Bargaining chips become permanent. Traore had frozen the ability to manufacture permanence. In response, the contract landlords tried a new moral shield. They claimed the reform would harm food production by discouraging investment. They argued that big projects bring development. They suggested that local farming is inefficient, that modern agriculture requires large-scale control. Traore listened and felt the insult under the argument. They were calling farmers inefficient in the same breath they were taking farmers' land. He responded by shifting the debate to outcomes again. If you claim you bring development, show the harvest, show the jobs, show the local supply, show the community benefit. If all you bring is fences and paperwork, you are not developing. You are capturing. By now, the country's attention was fully engaged. Villagers watched the hearings. Farmers began bringing documents forward. Some communities discovered contracts they had never truly understood. Others realized signatures had been obtained through intermediaries with promises that were never kept. Traore saw something powerful rising beneath the chaos. Clarity. Not everyone agreed with him, but more people understood the battlefield now. This was not a fight about ideology. It was a fight about who gets to hold the soil, and Traore knew the final phase would decide everything. Would the reform become a permanent protection, or would the capture class succeed in turning fear into reversal? Traore knew the reform would only survive if it produced one thing the capture class could not argue with: proof. Not speeches, not intentions, not slogans. Proof that the old land model was not development, but disguised ownership designed to outlive governments. So he authorized the first high-profile strategic land hearing in Ouagadougou, but he treated it like a controlled exposure, not a media circus. The objective was to reveal the structure of capture, not to create a spectacle of blame. The case chosen was deliberate: a strategic agricultural corridor where farmers had reported restricted access to water routes, sudden fencing, and lease expansions that appeared without community consent. On paper, the contracts looked clean: long-term leases, subcontracting, investment commitments. But Traore understood that capture lives in fine print. During the hearing, the commission demanded a full disclosure of beneficial ownership. Not the local signatory, not the intermediary, the actual beneficiary, the one who profits at the end of the chain. The representative tried to resist. Citing confidentiality, Traore's team denied the maneuver. Confidentiality might protect a commercial recipe. It does not protect the identity of who is acquiring a nation's strategic land. The representative then shifted to emotion, claiming the reform threatened investment and jobs. Traore watched and felt the old trick repeating itself. When the paper is questioned, they point to promises. They talk about future jobs, future infrastructure, future development. Traore ordered the commission to ask only one question: what has been delivered already? When the documents were produced, the gap was obvious. The lease had existed long enough to show results, but the promised projects were mostly plans. The community benefits were vague. The job numbers were minimal. The training programs were paperwork. The local procurement commitments were thin. But the fencing was real. The restricted access was real. The displacement pressure was real. Traore felt the room shift, not into celebration, but into recognition. People could see what the model did. It created a legal right to control land while delaying the obligations that would justify that control. Then the commission revealed the intermediary chain. The lease had been signed through a local entity that looked independent. That entity was tied to a second entity registered elsewhere. That second entity was tied to a consultancy that had no obvious agricultural function. And behind the consultancy sat a beneficiary structure connected to the same small circle that kept appearing across multiple strategic leases. It was not a one-off deal. It was a network. Traore's jaw tightened, not because he enjoyed this, but because he could see the moral crime clearly now. People had been told these leases were modernization. In reality, they were mechanisms for long-term control, disguised as partnership. The opposing lawyers tried to fight back, claiming this was normal corporate structure. Traore's team answered with the only response that mattered. Normal for corporations is not automatically acceptable for a sovereign nation's strategic soil. If the structure is designed to hide the beneficiary, it is designed to hide accountability. That is the point. The hearing then moved to the community testimony. Farmers spoke without theatrical anger. They spoke with practical pain. A route to water that had been used for generations now blocked. Fields reduced. Grazing paths narrowed. Promises of compensation delayed. Local officials pressured to sign clarifications they did not understand. Traore listened and felt something bitter in his chest. This was how capture works. It does not arrive as an invasion. It arrives as a contract that slowly changes what is possible for ordinary people. Then, Traore made the decisive enforcement announcement. Strategic leases that function as ownership without verified community benefit would be restructured. Expansions would be halted until obligations were delivered. Beneficial ownership disclosure would be mandatory. Any contract obtained through deception or coercion would be subject to cancellation. The capture class reacted immediately. They warned of lawsuits. They threatened international arbitration. They accused Traore of undermining the rule of law. Traore refused the framing. Rule of law is not rule of paper. Rule of law is rule of legitimacy, and legitimacy requires that strategic land serve the people who live on it, not only the people who can afford lawyers. The announcement changed the balance of the fight. Because the capture class could handle debate, it could handle rumors, it could handle media narratives. What it could not handle was a state that was willing to enforce disclosure and restructure contracts. That is where their profits lived, in secrecy and permanence. Traore had threatened both. And once secrecy is threatened, the model begins to collapse, because it can no longer hide behind complexity. It must defend itself openly, and open defense is where moral cover dies. By the end of the day, Ouagadougou felt different. The city had not erupted, but it had quieted in a new way. People were processing what they had seen, not a leader shouting, a system exposed. Traore understood the final phase now. It would not be about one case. It would be about whether the country accepted a new principle. Land is not merely property. Land is national life, and national life cannot be rented in darkness. Traore knew land reform is one of the most dangerous decisions a leader can make. Not because land is emotional, although it is, but because land is the quiet foundation of everything else. Food, work, migration, security, identity, peace. When land is captured, everything downstream becomes fragile. Villages empty, prices rise, young people leave, conflicts ignite, and the state spends its energy managing symptoms while the cause grows stronger behind fences and contracts. Traore refused to manage symptoms. He chose to confront the cause. He understood that strategic land cannot be treated like a casual commodity. A nation that sells its soil without safeguards sells its future in installments. The payment feels small today, but the cost becomes permanent tomorrow. That is why he targeted disguised ownership. He did not declare war on property, he declared war on capture. He did not attack farmers. He defended farmers from a paper empire that could expand quietly until families had nowhere left to stand. The capture class tried to turn the reform into panic. They spread the confiscation lie because fear is faster than truth. They funded lawsuits because delay kills enforcement. They staged provocation because one violent image can travel farther than 100 quiet hearings. Traore refused the traps. He chose clarity. He protected cultivation rights. He opened hearings. He demanded beneficial ownership disclosure. He forced the public to see what had been hidden. Contracts that promised development while delivering fences. Leases that behaved like ownership while postponing obligations. Intermediaries that looked local while serving distant beneficiaries. He made the debate honest again. Not rights versus tyranny, but life versus disguised power. Because for a farmer, land is not an abstract asset. It is the difference between feeding children and watching them go hungry. It is the difference between staying rooted and being forced onto the road. It is the difference between dignity and dependency. Traore understood that food security is not achieved through speeches. It is achieved by protecting the soil and the people who cultivate it. A country that cannot secure its farmland, cannot secure its stability. Hunger is a weapon, and land capture is how that weapon is built. He also understood something many leaders avoid admitting. Some forms of ownership are not meant to serve the nation. They are meant to control it. When a few contract landlords can fence strategic land, they do not only control crops, they control politics, they control prices, they control movement, they control the pressure points that can break a government when the time is right. Traore refused to let Burkina Faso be governed by fences. He chose a different principle. Strategic land exists to sustain the people first. Investment is welcome when it produces real, local outcomes, real food, real jobs, real water access, real accountability. But capture is not investment. Capture is a disguised takeover. And takeovers, even when written in perfect legal language, remain what they are. Traore knew the reform would continue to be contested. The old model would not surrender politely. People who profited from darkness would keep trying to manufacture fear, but he also knew that once a country sees the mechanism, it becomes harder to hide it again. That is what the hearings achieved. They did not only change contracts, they changed what people will tolerate. In the end, this was never just a policy fight. It was a decision about what kind of nation Burkina Faso would be. A place where the soil can be rented away from its people, or a place where the soil is protected as national life. Traore chose protection. If you want the next chapter, comment one word: soil.